Welcome. We are continuing to work through Daniel 11, and in this video we'll be covering verses 13 to 17. Before doing that, let's just backtrack a bit to get our bearings. So in verse 11, we read, "Then the king of the south will march out in a rage and fight against the king of the north, who will raise a large army, but it will be defeated." Now this is referring to the Battle of Raphia, in which Ptolemy IV pushes back against Antiochus III and reasserts his dominance over Judea. In verse 12, we read, "After the enemy is swept away, the king of the south will be filled with pride and will execute many thousands of his enemies, but his success will be short-lived." As we spoke about in the last video, immediately after Ptolemy's success at the Battle of Raphia, the people of Egypt begin revolting against his kingship, and this leaves Egypt extremely vulnerable to another attack by the Seleucids. And sure enough, Antiochus, after his defeat, begins building his army to attack Ptolemy again. We read this in verse 13. "For the king of the north shall again raise a multitude larger than the former, and after some years he shall advance with a great army and abundant supplies." So the king of the north is referring to Antiochus III, who after losing to Ptolemy at the Battle of Raphia will begin to raise an even larger army. But this attack from Antiochus isn't immediate, but rather, as the text tells us, occurs after some years. So Antiochus is using this time to build up his forces in order that he can advance with a great army and abundant supplies. Golden Gate writes in his commentary, "The northern king will return and raise a larger horde. Over the next 14 years, Antiochus campaigned in Turkey and the east and regained much of the old Seleucid Empire, winning for himself the title Great. Then he raised an even larger army in alliance with Philip V of Macedon to invade the Ptolemaic kingdom." So to summarize Golden Gate here, after the Fourth Syrian War, Antiochus III begins campaigning in Turkey, winning back much of the former territory of the Seleucid Empire. During this time, down in Egypt, Ptolemy IV dies, and his son Ptolemy V takes the throne. And remember, Ptolemy V is only a child when he becomes king. So not only is Egypt going through an internal rebellion, but they also have a child king. So the Ptolemaic Empire is incredibly weak at this time. Therefore, Antiochus III decides to take advantage of this situation and makes an alliance with Philip V of Macedon to invade Egypt. And this initiates the Fifth Syrian War. Newsom writes, "Antiochus III made a pact in 203-202 with Philip V, king of Macedonia, for a coordinated attack on Egypt in what is known as the Fifth Syrian War." We read about the Fifth Syrian War in the writings of Polybius, who's really quite disgusted by Antiochus and Philip's decision to attack Ptolemy V, a mere child. Polybius feels that Antiochus and Philip should have actually helped Ptolemy V when he took the throne instead of attacking him. Polybius writes the following, "It is very surprising that as long as Ptolemy IV in his lifetime could dispense with the help of Philip and Antiochus, they were very ready to assist him. But when he died, leaving an infant son, whom it was their natural duty to maintain in possession of his realm, then encouraging each other, they hastened to divide the child's kingdom between themselves and be the ruin of the unhappy orphan." The Fifth Syrian War is mentioned in verse 14 of Daniel, which reads, "In those times many shall rise against the king of the south. The lawless among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail." Okay, so verse 14 is very interesting. So let's break it down. First, take note of the fact that it says, "Many shall rise against the king of the south." Now, this is most likely referring to the involvement of Philip, but it may also be alluding to the fact of the Egyptian rebellion as well. Newsom writes, "The statement in verse 14 that many will arise against the king of the south could be a compressed allusion both to the native rebellion in Egypt and to the involvement of Philip of Macedon in the Fifth Syrian War." The next part of verse 14 is also very quite interesting. It says, "The lawless among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail." Now, what exactly does this mean? Well, to state the obvious, the author of Daniel 11 is Jewish. Therefore, the lawless among your own people must be referring to some sort of Jewish uprising during this time. Now, we don't have any sources that confirm this. So we're speculating here, but most likely some Jewish people probably interpreted all the turmoil of the 5th Syrian War as initiating the end of times, meaning they thought that God would soon intervene and establish a Jewish state in Israel. Therefore, some Jewish people during this time also began to revolt against Ptolemy, thinking that God would help them. Newsom very convincingly speaks about this, writing, "It does seem plausible that some Jews may have interpreted the upheavals of the 5th Syrian War in eschatological terms, much as the author of Daniel 11 is interpreting the events of the Antiochus crisis as the fulfillment of an eschatological vision." Let's pause here a moment because there's a lot to unpack in this Newsom quote. Let's take these two events, the 5th Syrian War and Antiochus crisis, and put them on a timeline. So according to verse 14, some Jews at the time of the 5th Syrian War interpreted all the upheaval as a sign of the end of time. However, the author of Daniel 11 does not think that this is the case because he's living at a later period. He's living during the time of the Antiochus crisis, in which the Seleucid king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, is persecuting the Jewish people by outlawing religious practices. So the author of Daniel 11 views the Antiochus crisis as the end of time. And sure enough, when we get to the end of chapter 11 and then start chapter 12, when the author is describing the Antiochus crisis, he'll predict that immediately after this event, the end will come and the dead shall rise. Let's now go back and continue to read this Newsom quote. "It does seem plausible that some Jews may have interpreted the upheavals of the 5th Syrian War in eschatological terms, much as the author of Daniel 11 is interpreting the events of the Antiochus crisis as the fulfillment of an eschatological vision." From the perspective of the author of Daniel, however, this earlier movement failed because the appointed time had not, in fact, arrived. Thus, whether or not these persons were actually violent, or whether this is just a pejorative label, they did not, in the eyes of the author of Daniel 11, understand the divine plan. Consequently, they failed. Let's now go on to read verses 15 and 16, which tells us that Antiochus successfully defeats Ptolemy in battle and expands his territory into Judea. In verse 15 we read, "Then the king of the north shall come and throw up siege works, and take a well-fortified city. And the forces of the south shall not stand, not even his picked troops, for there shall be no strength to resist." In verse 16 we read, "But he who comes against him shall take the action he pleases, and no one shall withstand him." This is referring to Antiochus III. "He shall take a position in the beautiful land, and all of it shall be in his power." So the text says that Antiochus III gains control of the beautiful land, an obvious reference to Judea. And this nicely aligns with history because we know that Antiochus III defeats Ptolemy, dealing a decisive victory at the Battle of Panium in 200 BC, giving him control of all of Judea. Goldingay writes in his commentary, "Antiochus thus gained firm control of Palestine and Phoenicia, including Judea, and also captured some of the areas of the coast of Asia Minor that had been subject to Egyptian rule, Cilicia, Lycia, and Caria. He was in a position to invade Egypt itself and destroy the Ptolemaic Empire, but he feared Roman intervention." So here we're introduced to a new and major figure, which is the Roman Republic. They have been growing in influence in this part of the world, and Rome has actually been importing grain from Egypt to feed their population. So Antiochus is afraid that if he invades Egypt and interrupts the Roman food supply, he'll then have to go to battle with Rome. And he knows he can't militarily defeat Rome, so he refrains from attacking Egypt. So here we can picture Rome standing between Antiochus III and Ptolemy V, preventing Antiochus from militarily invading Egypt. But Antiochus devises another way of gaining control of Egypt. Goldingay writes, "Instead, Antiochus made peace with Egypt in 197, betrothing his daughter Cleopatra to Ptolemy V. He hoped to further his designs on Egypt through her, but she, Egypt's first Cleopatra, became perfectly loyal to her husband and new homeland." Goldingay continues to write, "Cleopatra I encouraged an Egyptian alliance with Rome, which frustrated Antiochus's continuing designs on the Ptolemaic area of the old empire of Alexander." So to put it simply, Antiochus's plan backfires. And we read all about this marriage in verse 17, which says, "He shall set his mind to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of peace and perform them. In order to destroy the kingdom, he shall give him a woman in marriage, but it shall not succeed or be to his advantage." Let's now spend some time breaking down verse 17 here. So note that it says, "In order to destroy the kingdom, he shall give him a woman in marriage." Antiochus gives his daughter Cleopatra to Ptolemy for marriage. So Cleopatra I is the daughter of Antiochus III, and she is given into marriage to Ptolemy V. And Antiochus is pretending that this is some sort of peace treaty after the 5th Syrian War, but in actuality, he plans for his daughter to undermine the Ptolemaic Empire from within. But Antiochus's plan backfires as Cleopatra becomes loyal to Egypt and urges her new husband to strengthen their alliance with Rome. And that's why the text says, "But it shall not succeed or be to his advantage." It's also important to note here that this isn't the famous Cleopatra, who is Cleopatra VII, who had a relationship with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. This is instead the very first Cleopatra, Cleopatra I. Now, we have quite a few sources that tell us about this marriage between Ptolemy V and Cleopatra. Josephus writes, "After this, Antiochus made a friendship and league with Ptolemy and gave him his daughter Cleopatra to wife." Also, Appian writes about this marriage, saying the following, "Now, determining no longer to conceal his intended war with the Romans, he formed alliances by marriage with the neighboring kings. To Ptolemy in Egypt, he sent his daughter Cleopatra, surnamed Syria, thus flattering the young king in order to keep him quiet during the war with the Romans." So note here that Appian tells us the reason why Antiochus gives his daughter into marriage with Ptolemy is in an attempt to strategically outmaneuver the Romans. Before we conclude this video, I just want to pause for a moment and take note of the fact that this is the second marriage alliance we have seen thus far in Daniel 11. The first marriage alliance was in 250 BC, in which Ptolemy II gives his daughter Bernice to Antiochus II. And in this video, we've seen our second marriage alliance in 197 BC, in which a Seleucid king, Antiochus III, gives his daughter to a Ptolemaic king, Ptolemy V. I think it's really important that we just pause every once in a while and appreciate and marvel at the accuracy of Daniel 11. The author is detailing with ever so minute detail all the events of this time period. In his commentary, C.L. So notes the following about Daniel 11 verses 5 to 20, that, quote, "The history of the conflict between the Seleucids and Ptolemies is recounted in pedantic detail, virtually every bit of which may be corroborated by other sources." And that is where we're going to end this video. As always, if you're enjoying these videos, your support would be greatly appreciated. So please consider supporting me on Patreon. Find the link in the description below. Patrons can receive early access to my videos and these PowerPoints that I use to make these videos. If donating isn't something that you're able to do, it's still tremendously helpful if you hit that like button, leave some comments, and finally make sure you're subscribed to get my next video. Thank you for watching all the way until the end, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.